All right, so in this video, we're going to start talking about the Cold War. And the Cold War is the framework to understand the second half of the 20th century. So everything that happens after World War II is influenced somehow by the Cold War. And so what we're going to do in this video and in the next video is cover this general framework to understand all the other stuff that's going to happen over the course of the 50 or so years that round out the 20th century. So we'll start by doing a little bit of context. During the latter part of World War II, Stalin became very suspicious of his Western allies. He thought that they weren't doing what they were supposed to do to help the Soviet Union. They weren't really allies. So, for example, the rather late entry of the United States into the European theater of the war was evidence in Stalin's mind of them trying to betray the Soviet Union. And to give Stalin some credit, he was probably a little bit right about that. So he was suspicious of the motives of his supposed allies. So when the war ends and we get the post-war conferences, specifically the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, we see Stalin's suspicions come out in some of the actions he takes during and after the conference. So at this conference, they discuss a number of things. So they discuss German reparations, some of which would be paid off in forced labor from German prisoners of war, the recreation of Poland, and the assurances that the Soviet army would leave Eastern Europe and allow for democratic elections. They also agreed to to create and join the United Nations, which kind of acts as a League of Nations 2.0. So we've kind of figured out some of the problems in the League of Nations, and we're going to fix them in this new United Nations. And Stalin agreed to join this. But the most important thing, especially for understanding what's going to happen in the Cold War, is that they all agreed to jointly administer Germany by dividing it into 4 occupation zones, each run by one of the Allies. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was to be divided the same way. And on top of this, Austria was divided the same way too. But we're not really worried about Austria, and we'll wrap their story up in just a minute. Now, remember, Stalin looks at all of this with a lot of suspicion. So Stalin goes back on many of his promises from Potsdam. So he goes back on a lot of his actions, specifically that one and this idea about jointly administering Germany. So right off the bat, right after this, the Soviet army refuses to leave Eastern Europe. And over the next year or so, they overthrow the legitimate governments and install Stalinist dictatorships. So these are communist countries with state-run economies. So they're not capitalist. And they are all aligned with the Soviet Union. And Stalin did this to create a buffer between the Soviet Union and the West. He does not trust them, so he creates this buffer area in between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies of Western Europe. This area becomes known as the Iron Curtain. if we jump ahead to another thing that Stalin does that breaks a promise from Potsdam, we get to 1948. So in 1948, the Soviets unexpectedly closed down all the land routes into Berlin. So let me pull up a map. So here is a map of Germany. So you've got the Soviet zone here in red, the British zone in green, the American zone here in orange, and the French zone over here. We can also see pieces of Germany that were taken away to give back to Poland. But you can also note that Berlin is divided in the same way as Germany. So there's a little Soviet zone, American zone, British zone, and French zone. And the fact that this city is located in the Soviet zone allowed Stalin to cut off access to it. The point of this was to try to force the others out of Berlin. The other allies react with the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift was a 24/7 resupply of the city via planes. So planes were constantly landing and taking off, supplying the city with food and medicine and rebuilding supplies, because the city was essentially blown up during the war. And so the Berlin Airlift also brought in rebuilding supplies. This took place between June of 1948 into April of 1949. At that point, Stalin just gives up and opens the roads back up. So instead of having a united communist East Germany, when the Allies leave in 1949, the United States, Great Britain, and France turn their zones into a Western-aligned, capitalist West Germany. And the Soviets create a communist state-run East Germany. Now, the problem here is with Berlin. Stalin was trying to get the Allies to leave Berlin so that he would have an intact Berlin as the capital of East Germany. But the Western-aligned parts of Berlin were turned into a democratic, capitalist city in the middle of a communist country. And to just wrap that story up real quick, in 1961, so many East Germans were escaping through West Germany, or through West Berlin, that the East German government built a wall around the city to keep people in. And this became known as the infamous Berlin Wall. When the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, that is one of the first signals that the Cold War is finally coming to an end. Now, to wrap up the story of Austria, because Austria has been with us pretty much since the beginning of the Euro course, Austria was divided the same way that Germany was. But because Austria was annexed by Germany, the Soviets had a little bit more sympathy for the Austrians. They didn't have much sympathy for the Germans, but they did have some sympathy for the Austrians. They were another victim of the Germans. And Austria was divided in a similar way as Germany. So it was divided into 4 pieces, and Vienna, the capital of Austria, was also divided into 4 pieces. But unlike Germany, the Soviets allowed Austria to remain intact as long as they stayed neutral in international affairs. And they did, and it's been that way since 1955. So since 1955, Austria has remained neutral, and they've never bothered anyone again, really. So Austria is now done. There's not much more to talk about in terms of what Austria does in European history. So all of this stuff we've covered so far has mainly been Soviet actions. So what did Western governments do in response to what the Soviets are doing? So seeing that the Soviets are acting in bad faith, democratic countries begin organizing a response. And these responses take 2 forms. There are economic responses and military responses. So we'll handle the economic stuff first. So, one of the really important economic responses from Western governments to what the Soviets are doing is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is going to sound a little bit familiar because what the Marshall Plan was American aid to European countries to help them rebuild. But unlike the Dawes Plan after World War I, this was not a loan. This was just aid. It was just a gift. So why do this? One, the Americans want to trade with European countries. And they can't trade with people who have a destroyed economy, so they want to help rebuild their economies. But they also want to make friends. And so what we start to see here is this bipolar system that really marks what the Cold War is all about. You're either with the United States or you are with the Soviet Union. And the money that the Americans are putting forward here put you solely with the Americans. So this was for anybody and everybody who wanted it, but the Soviets threatened any communist country that indicated they wanted the money. So, because the Americans are out there throwing money around, the Soviets decide they need to do the same thing. So the Soviets offer their own aid package. And this becomes called Comecon. So the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. The Soviets love to make big acronyms or big abbreviations for long-winded titles. So Comecon was their version of the Marshall Plan. The United States is also going to create or help create a number of economic institutions. And these were things that were designed to promote capitalism and prevent the conditions that led to World War I. So there were a number of economic conditions that made Germany make the decisions that led to World War II. And so what the United States and their allies are going to try to do is create institutions to prevent this. So for instance, the International Monetary Fund. Or the IMF, was designed to help countries pay international debt. One of the reasons that Germany fell into the trap of fascism was that they were crippled by this international debt. The International Monetary Fund is designed to help countries pay their international debts. It's a safety net. We also get the World Bank, which helps to fund big infrastructure projects. So if we have this World Bank, we're not relying on the United States or the Soviets or anybody to help you build things your country needs. You've got this neutral or supposedly neutral organization that helps fund these projects instead of being beholden to another country. Militarily, we get another set of responses. And the biggest one of these military responses was the creation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was designed to counter either German or Soviet aggression in the future. Now, over time, the Germans will start playing by all the rules and they won't really be a threat. So really what NATO is about is countering Soviet aggression. In fact, the Soviets asked to join NATO in 1955 after Germany is allowed to rearm. And considering the history between the Soviets and the Germans, it's not surprising that the Soviets might turn to their, supposed allies and say the Germans are a threat. We'd like to join your organization that is against German aggression. The Soviets are refused. So now that it becomes very clear that NATO is against Soviet aggression, the Soviets form their own version of NATO. And it's called the Warsaw Pact. The big policy of NATO was this idea of containment. Contain communism where it is. And at first, it seems to work. In 1947, NATO helps prevent Greece from falling to communism. But the big containment failure happens in 1949 when China becomes communist. And we'll deal with the repercussions of that in a future video. One last little military / kind of a cultural response was the creation of Radio Free Europe. Radio Free Europe was a thing created by the British. So the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, transmitted Western news and music into Eastern Europe to try to prod the people to peacefully resist. So it was a way to transmit maybe more accurate news into a place where the news might not be so accurate. So we're going to stop there. In the next video, we'll talk about all of the repercussions that came about as a result of China becoming communist and all of the maybe later ideas of the Cold War. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.